We're gonna get going. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for staying with us this afternoon. I'm Ira Wagman from Carleton University in Ottawa, the capital city of Canada. Great to be here with you and to be the chair of this very interesting panel, which is about innovation in online distribution. So we'll follow the same format as this morning, one paper after the other, and then Philip Drake from Queen Margaret University will provide minutes of response and then open up the questions. To just make a note that the organizers have asked me to speak to the fact that the arrangement of the panel here, which is all male, is not an ideal situation, and the organizers would like me to acknowledge that point. Okay, so we'll get started. So we start with Paul Stepan from Focus, the Institute for Cultural and Media Economics in Vienna. And his paper is entitled Copyright, Innovation and Inertia, Digitization of the Film Industry.
Hello. Well, now, between sending in an abstract and actually giving a presentation, there is often a lot of time. And over this time, things come apparent and you start to change something here and something there. And then in the end, if you look at it, the paper might be a little bit different than what you actually sent in. I'm sorry for that. My problem was, or where I hit a snag, was that well, there are two different kind of narratives, and one is that, and most of the literature, especially in economics, is always about the US and the US markets. So this is what I started with. Is this too small? Yeah, that's okay. This is what I started with, is the digitization turned the whole world of the film industry upside down. We had completely new business models. Business models changed from selling products to selling access, which is very, I mean, sounds pretty easy, but what actually happened is, for the first time, the industry was faced with a problem. They had to sell content. They've never done that before. They always sold carriers, they always sold books, they sold DVDs, they sold CDs, VHS, whatever. They've never sold content because the carrier was easy to sell, because they are scarce goods that you can actually exclude somebody from. They have sold tickets. So the ticket itself was at least a private good, even if the show wasn't in the theater. But what they have done now is they completely switched over. If you look at Netflix, and if you look at Spotify, Amazon Prime, HBO, whatever, then you would see that what you buy now is access. So it's a service, really. It's not a good anymore. If I stop buying books, I will have all the books I've already bought at home. If I stop paying into Spotify, I'm left with nothing. There's absolutely nothing on my phone after 30 days. If I stop paying for Netflix, the same thing. So this was one of the biggest changes at the beginning. Then the next one was completely new companies entered the market. So Spotify, Deezer, Google, Netflix, Amazon Prime, etc., they all haven't been players in the movie markets or in the music business before. They just weren't there. And this is very typical for this kind of paradigmatic changes, that new players enter a market, and that often the old big industry companies either adapt or go down, which didn't happen really that drastically because of the copyright backlog and the catalogs they own, so it's not so easy to just cast them aside and say we are only producing new stuff. But still, very, very huge firms made it onto this market. What you also could see is that in this international market, you had strengthening of the vertical integration. That means the new players didn't only want to distribute, they also wanted to produce. That gave them a second pillar of income stream, but also made them distinctible from other companies. The sequential distribution was changed dramatically, which started almost 10 years ago. Sequential distribution is the way of distributing films, or it was the way of distributing films, segregated by both regions and technology. So between a theatrical release in the US, sometimes even there was a time difference between East and West Coast. So between a theatrical release in the US and a terrestrial television broadcast in Austria, there might be 3, 4, 5 years. That's only because of the distribution choices and release choices made both globally and by technology. So one of the biggest changes here was that through to, or thanks to, however you want to phrase it, illegal file sharing, illegal distribution, illegal streaming, there was a competitor. So suddenly there was a competitor, and people, if they didn't get the content they wanted, they found a way to get it. So the industry had a competitor they couldn't control with competition law or anything. They had to kind of face this kind of competition soon or later. And also since very, very early on, since the early 2000s, this time difference between different countries was the strongest incentive for people to resort to illegal demand. So we have all these huge changes in the global film industry, and then I thought to myself, well, I mean, if it's true for the US, it must be kind of true for Austria, maybe on a smaller scale, and maybe a little bit later, and so let's see what happened there. And so many factors changed, so I checked. I just pushed some buttons and wanted to see where are the huge changes. So I checked the numbers of feature films in Austria per year. That went up about 30%, which is true for the whole EU. Between 2008 and 2015, I think it went from 1,000 to 1,500, 1,600, something like that, films in the whole EU. Funding went also up 30%, and this is when the alarm bells start to ring, because I knew that in Austria funding made for 95% of all the investments in feature film. So if the funding goes up by 30% and the number of film goes up by 30%, okay, there's obviously a correlation. It has nothing to do with external influences. The number of companies in the sector slightly increased. The number of people working in the sector slightly increased. The average cost of a movie, more or less stable. The average visitor per movie slightly decreased. So basically we have a little bit more movies with a little bit less audience per movie. New business models. There are no new business models, neither in the distribution nor in the production in Austria. There are Netflix-like attempts that go back now, I don't know, 7, 8 years. But there are no new key players. They are just there, and they're mostly irrelevant, and all production companies, if they try to get the movies out there, rather make a deal, of course, with Netflix or Amazon than with a local Austrian provider with a very limited customer base. So basically there are two narratives. One, and that fits very well to the self-image and the self-esteem of most of the people in the film industry in Austria, is it's a smaller version of Hollywood. It's glamorous. It's part of an industry. It's an industry. It's not a sector. It's not an art form. It's an industry. And there is a second one that can also be corroborated by with numbers, and that is that it is basically publicly funded art form. Anyone seen this? Show of hands. Do you know that movie? So basically in that movie, the producers, two Broadway producers found out that they can make more money by over-financing the production and then having a flop. Right? So over-financing the production and then not selling anything is a good way to get money, because afterwards nobody will ask you to share the profits, because everybody knows there are no profits. So nobody would ask you what you've done with the money in the first place. This is, to a large extent, how the film industry in Austria works. And I'm not doing that to ridicule it. It is very, very honest and very clear response of the producers to a certain funding model. So the incentives given by the funding model, and that is what I would rather make fun of than the producers who figured out how to deal with it, is problematic. I looked at the top 50 movies produced a couple of years back now, and so I went really through all accounts from them that were given to the film fund, and tried to find out to what extent are they funded. And they're funded on the average to 95%. So now we're talking about money and not about some sort of contribution in kind, not accounted labor or something, but real money. So 95%. 95% is a very strong incentive to produce a movie, because all you have to get back is 5% and you break even. And when that happens, you have already paid the producer fee. You have paid everyone on the set. So it's really, you break even with 5%. So what does this all have to do with copyright? We have two principles, two incentives, how to motivate people to be creative. One is a direct subsidy on the supply side. So you give money to creators, to producers, to institutions in order to supply something. And you're not so much worried about the demand side because it is about cultural diversity, it's about many of the values we also discussed this morning. So it's a decision from a cultural policy standpoint. The other way of how to stimulate creation is through the demand side. And through the demand side, in this case, it is copyright. So what copyright does economically is it gives you the possibility to exclude people. It gives you the right for a temporary monopoly. It gives you the possibility to charge price above a competitive price. This is what copyright does. And with that higher price that you get, you can do something. You can recoup all the initial investments, all the investments that you had to do in order to get a movie, to get to the first copy. So producing the movie, directing, having a book, having everything that is associated with it, until you have the first copy, the master copy that you can then start copying in order to screen it in cinemas, in order to upload it to Netflix or Amazon or whatever. And all these costs are considered to be sunk costs. So costs that you cannot recoup other than through selling the product afterwards. If you would do that with something completely different, like a bar, and you buy bar stools and tables and everything, and then you go bankrupt or you don't want to go on with it, you can still sell these bar stools and the bar and the glasses and the tablecloth. With a movie that is not ready, you can't sell anything, you can't sell parts of it. You have to go to the end, you have to have the master copy, and only then you can start actually selling something and trying to recoup the costs. So what the copyright does is it provides you with an incentive to create. It gives you something to balance out the risk you're taking to invest into a movie, into music, into literature. Now, if you don't have any risk because it's already paid for, and then you get the copyright on top, you would say that's a very good deal. You want that. But there's always a but. The subsidies you get for the creation is you have to pay back as soon as you make money, and it goes like this. If you only look at cinema distribution, but it goes with the other distributions exactly the same way. If you look at cinema distribution, I have to talk faster because he keeps showing me minute signs. Then this would mean that 50% usually of a cinema ticket stays in the cinema and 50% go to the distributor. The distributor keeps that money as long as they need to cover their own costs for marketing and whatever they had to lay out in order to promote the movie. And when they are when they are covered their own costs, they start splitting it 50-50 with the producer. So the producer would get 25 of each cinema ticket. So the producer keeps the money until he has covered his or her own costs. So the initial investment of about 5% of the movie. And after that, they would have to share their income with the funders, according to how much they got from which funding body. So in Austria, it's the Österreichische Filminstitut. They would have to give them about 35–40% probably, and then the Filmfonds Wien, they would get another 25–30%, and so on. So what they're really left with afterwards is 5% of 25% of a cinema ticket. So their incentive to really invest or to do something to promote the movie is not really there. Their work basically is done as soon as they have produced it. So there are two things we can conclude from that, and that is the distribution in Austria is highly underused. There are ways to get a much bigger audience. Most of the incentives provided by copyright are cancelled out through the funding structure. So you have two systems that try to create, make people create things, but the incentives given by the one are cancelling out the incentives given by the other. So you need to find another funding structure in order to actually not only produce, but make them available. And this goes especially for Austria, before we start to worry about DSM, we have to make the copyright valuable. So currently, the value of copyright is that it creates windfall profits. But they are not a really integral part of any kind of financing or decision making. So thank you.
Okay, so next up, we have Balázs Varga from ELTE University in Hungary, in Budapest. And his paper is entitled Ants and Giants, Formal and Informal Practices of Online Film Circulation in Hungary.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I will continue with another small markets perspective, and what I will try to contextualize and try to provide you a short overview. I will concentrate only one small aspect, and that is the online circulation of Hungarian films in the Hungarian online market. But as the as the title refers, I will have to begin with scale and size, because Europe is big and Europe is small, and in terms of population, for example. And I think that although the titles might suggest that there is a kind of antagonistic binary opposition between giants and ants, small and big, I would rather say it's kind of relational question. And I would rather use small and medium size market, because you could clearly see that that's a continuum, and you cannot actually divide this continuum. So in the previous panel, the so-called structural peculiarities of small media systems were introduced, like shortage of resources, small media markets, vulnerability, dependence. And I will try to highlight two aspects of them, or add some aspects, like audience habits and the market dynamics influenced by the local politics. But to contextualize, I will the next following facts are from a recent publication, or end of last year's publication by the European Audiovisual Observatory. Again, to contextualize the Hungarian or Central European landscape. So we can see that there are quite striking differences in SVOD subscriptions in Europe. Of course, influenced by the market size, but in terms of penetration as well. Nordic countries and the so-called big markets are leading the statistics. And definitely in terms of SVOD revenues, there are strong differences, which make that only a small group of countries make the 2/3 or more than 2/3 of revenues for the SVOD market in Europe. And if you just focus or zoom in on smaller or medium markets, you could see that still there are some discrepancies. So I think that's the big picture in which I will try to situate the Hungarian market and the Central Eastern European markets. Because it is usually said in reports that there are bright prospects for VOD and SVOD platforms in Eastern or Central Eastern Europe, but this is the territory where even the giants had to face some problems. One problem might be the language. For example, in case of Hungary, in a medium or small country, logged or blogged in its language, with the limitation of English-speaking population. So that goes with the problem of localization of content, and well, it was great that I could use Peter's last year's essay on the Czech situation, entitled "Localize or Die," and there are some natural similarities between the Czech and the Hungarian situation, but there are some differences as well. So language seems one barrier, and the other, of course, the price. So that's why the shadow economies or the piracy problems quite relevant in Eastern Europe. So zooming into Hungarian situation, there are some statistics from the National Media and Info Communications Authority showing the digital media usage in Hungary, and you could see that global players in audiovisual content, I mean HBO Go and Netflix are on the top of the list, following Spotify and Deezer. And regarding the media usage, the online Hungarian language radio is on the top of the list. Hungarian language online television is the second. Music, and then with 30% comes film and video audiovisual content. Okay, as for the players, it's nothing surprising in it. The global players are here or are everywhere, with Netflix, Amazon, HBO Go. The regional or European mainstream providers are also like telecom companies, commercial TV channels, and local or regional media groups. And of course, there are the constant players of the art house distribution circle, plus some independent community-based niche companies. And the next step is, I think that is quite familiar for everyone from Central Europe, that it seems that somehow the giants or the global players had to face with some problems in terms of localization, and that is the segment or aspect in which even in, as far as I know, in the Czech Republic or in Hungary, HBO Go surpasses Netflix, because localization is not so we're familiar with the Netflix contents, but HBO Go provides everywhere Western premier content and everywhere in the region, and now not only in the region but globally, Eastern European local original television content from Pustina to the Hungarian series or the Polish or Romanian series. Perhaps the only drawback for the HBO Go, it's bad user interface, which might somehow block the access or discovery of not well-known contents, but still the price is on the HBO side, as far as it seems. So the next level is the regional players, which again I think in Hungary quite similar than in most of the countries in Eastern Europe. We have RTL Group's Hungarian RTL Club company and its online service. We have the market-leading telecom company, again, via Deutsche Telekom, Magyar Telekom Groups, Mozi Club, Cinema Club, SVOD, and TVOD service. And there is Central European Media Group, which is a local plus wannabe regional media group owning the leading Hungarian online news service, and In the Video, which is an online social media provider, and they have the In the Video film or film which provides Hungarian films access as well. So, and the as for the classical art house market, one of the leading player is Mozinet company, who distribute usually the Hungarian films, but in terms of their online or VOD platforms, it seems that only a small percent of their total revenue comes from VOD. There are some counterexamples. For example, after, as they distributed the Oscar Prize winner Son of Saul and the Berlinale winner Body and Soul, both of their films did well on VOD platforms, as you could see. And both of these films were quite popular in the theatrical distribution as well. But still, it seems that there are not that bright prospects and no resources for trying innovative practices on behalf of the classical traditional art house distributors. Okay, on the specificities, I think one of the most important specificity is that there is still quite a limited access to contemporary local films and archive hits and television production. Actually, almost 1/3 of contemporary Hungarian films were not distributed or released on DVD or Blu-ray and cannot get on TVOD or SVOD platforms. So that's one thing. The second, which not that Hungarian specificity, because it happens in other countries in the region, that the post economic crisis, backlash in the media market, and the de-westernization of the media markets. I mean, the departure of some Western companies and the takeover of their place by local or regional players, wannabe media oligarch with strong political contacts. That's quite a strong trend in Hungary, but happens in other countries in the region. The so-called strongman of the Hungarian Film Fund, the ex-Hollywood producer Andy Vajna, now he's the most influential media oligarch in Hungary. He owns the second largest Hungarian commercial TV. He owns special radio stations, plenty of newspapers, and dozens of casinos. So in one. And that's why perhaps the media concentration and the question of regulation, especially audiovisual policy or film policy, seems to be crucial, especially in case of Hungary. As for the lack of original contact, we can say that classic Hungarian films are present, but as a present. So that was the Hungarian Film Archives Christmas tale for the, but you could see only for limited time frame, but they will continue it. And it's coming soon. It will be that they will reveal at the end of this week a new SVOD platform specialized on Hungarian content. As far as I know, I could check, the company behind this Wowster project is politically well-based production and distribution company, and it seems that they will use this new platform only to distribute their contents and some of local television series and productions. So that's for the overview of the situation. So we could see that although after 2010, because of the reorganization of the whole film and support system, and after the setup of a new institution, which is a Hungarian Film Fund, which increased the state aid for Hungarian film industry, especially into Hungarian film production, and in quite an unorthodox way, the Hungarian Film Fund acts as a sole supporter of Hungarian films. So they're eager to give provide the total budget of the projects they greenlighted. They do not really focus on distribution, nor theatrical distribution or online distribution, and perhaps that's why after the 2010 changes, the whole Hungarian art house distribution and theatrical landscape has just collapsed. And now the companies had to build up themselves from the bottom up. Although now recently, as I just referred on Son of Soul and Body and Soul, there are some changes. I mean, there are some growth in the domestic markets market share, but it is still between 10 and 15%, and there is some, but still limited interest in local films, but only for those which did well in the festival or the local theatrical circuits. If we would like to ask for success stories or innovative projects, there is the project of two Hungarian filmmaker, Dezukom, which became an international platform for short films, but actually shorts are outside of the regular theatrical distribution. And of course, there are special AVOD markets for the animation, leading animation studio for animation and family films. Okay, one and last step behind and further up. We had a kind of early experiment in the market, which was FilmClick, a project of that time leading art house distribution company Budapest Film, which was owned by the city of Budapest. They tried to implement the TVOD service for Hungarian films and for non-mainstream films, but after the 2010 elections, after the radical political changes, the city refreshed their film policy. The company was sold to the Berlin-based A company, and they just closed FilmClick. However, the distribution expert behind FilmClick, with the help of some young cinephiles, began with a new project, and I will finish with their project, and not only just mention the shadow economies, which is quite strong in Hungary, producing higher numbers for films than they did in theatrical release. The Notebook is an art house film, the others are, let's say, commercial romantic comedies or black comedies. There were some trials on films which were theatrically failed, going to Fekete Black Soup went on the peer-to-peer torrent company. Coyote was uploaded on the YouTube after the failure at the box office and the debate between the director and the producer. But it seems that we have, after Giants, the Ants. So the group behind FilmClick began with Hungary Ant, a small distribution company and project. The title refers on the smallness and on the history of a interwar period Hungarian agriculture cooperative. They are busy, they are active, and they are small, and we love them. Or they are the market. And they will try to focus on the, as you can see, the young audience. And perhaps some of you might know Festival Scopes Network, which is Gutek Films initiative, but now works everywhere in Europe, providing and building audiences in special dedicated festival hits. So it seems now, and so that might be the future, to building from the bottom up. So the Hungarian situation says that giants may have faced problems, but ants will be ants. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to everyone for excellent papers. They are changing the batteries here in the microphone. Thank you also to everyone for not looking at me with mean looks as I'm showing you yellow and red cards for time, so I appreciate it. Lastly, we have Philip Drake here to offer some responses.
Would you like to wait for the microphone?
I think because we're tight for time, maybe...
Well, thank you very much to the panel for some terrific papers. I'll try and raise my voice so you can hear me. I think it's a really interesting group of papers to bring together, looking at innovation in online distribution. It's an area that I'm interested in myself, having worked on a project with the VOD platform for a couple of years, and looked at the data around that, and particularly that relationship with independent cinema.
So I want to give a very brief response to each of the papers and then perhaps look at a few questions. I'll try and keep it brief. I know we're a bit tight for time. So Paul talked about the importance of selling access and not content, looking at the Austrian example. And of course, raised a number of questions, including the rhetoric around the industry in relation to Hollywood on the one hand and publicly funded art films on the other. He looked at distribution in relation to digital disruption and the value chain, the ways in which the market is segmented, the ways in which platforms are calculated and increasingly ephemeral, if you like, they disappear if one unsubscribes from a particular platform, and the disruption in terms of new players into the country. I thought there was some striking points in relation to the emphasis you placed on the lack of new business models, the increase, for example, in production and funding having gone up 30%, and yet this very small percentage or proportion in relation to VOD and so on. So I thought that's kind of interesting. And also in relation to the discussion around producer and exhibitor splits in terms of revenues, and the ways in which that's the producer effectively is effectively a very small part of the revenue split in that instance. So the conclusions on that paper, I think, will pick up some of these issues around the idea of the small nation and then a medium-sized small nation. So there's a different kind of the smallness, but then there's small markets, but then there's also a larger small nation within those categories. And the ways in which distribution, perhaps, it seems to me, is underemphasized. And there is a substantial emphasis on production, and particularly, I think you mentioned state support and the state support for production. Patrick, I'll come on to say about looking at Spotify, really identified a series of questions. I won't repeat the paper, but looks firstly, I think you mentioned the risks of media scholars studying companies, and that raises a whole set of ethical questions that are very important. You identified what we might call a genuinely innovative disruptor in the case of Resonate as a perhaps contrast to Spotify. And I think that raises that question about what we define as innovation here. Not everything is innovative, and innovation requires some kind of, if you like, contrast perhaps to existing business practices in this instance. In terms of the process, I thought you raised a whole series of questions about avoiding this kind of binary between platform capitalism and platform cooperativism, and the methods around following the actor increasingly those techniques which are being used by information scientists or those people working in platform studies allow us access to those platforms and creating data around those platforms. But as I think you pointed out, also then raise a whole series of questions about violating the data usage in terms of our own ethics committees, violating the terms of use in terms of the platforms themselves. And of course, the verifiability of that data is a major problem. So your problems and recommendations I thought were very helpful. We'll probably come back to those in a discussion. How do we avoid overpowering analysis, as you called it, trying to do too much, and how do we decide that in advance if we don't know the kind of results we'll get? How do we avoid, or how do we justify breaking terms of service, and how do we get this through our ethics committees? What are the risks in doing these kind of things, and how do we try and predict those in advance? How do we make the assumptions that we're using explicit in terms of the things as one of your recommendations? I thought the suggestion for kind of ethics boards rather interesting in relation to subject associations. And you mentioned collaborating with companies in their beta phase, and I've experienced that. There's pros and cons absolutely to that as well. Moving on to Balázs, looking again at a small nation in terms of Hungarian film distribution. I thought this contrast between the ants and the giants there, and actually between formal and informal forms of media circulation or film circulation, was very interesting. Again, a medium-sized small country. I thought, again, so that you demonstrate through your data this skewed market, that actually we've got not one market here in terms of film distribution, we've got many different kinds of markets that we're looking at. And it was notable, I think, to see that the relatively low take-up of Netflix in relation to local platforms, which is perhaps against some of the overarching rhetoric around particular VOD platforms and their overall dominance, that this isn't the case in every single country, and I think that's quite valuable data. Interesting, again, you mentioned in terms of the Hungarian Film Fund, the increase in funds, but less focus on distribution. The distribution, inevitably, there seems to be a focus on increasing production, but many of those films don't reach audiences, and that's clearly a problem for filmmakers, a problem for funders and policymakers, and raises lots of questions about what we mean by diversity and plurality. I thought it was quite intriguing that animation, for example, had a specialist VOD. I wonder if that's an interestingly unique Hungarian case, or maybe other countries do as well. Moving on to Jan, looking at VOD platforms in Czechia. Again, this course you talked about overabundance versus choice. How do we navigate that? I thought you had some very valuable suggestions in relation to curation. The relationship between transactional VOD and subscription VOD, SVOD and TVOD, and the relationship between those, and clearly the shift towards TVOD platforms is interesting to see that operating in a small nation's context. And I think, again, the focus on the art house and interview methods brought out, again, this sort of same issue that was raised elsewhere about the significant increase in funding for production. But you've really identified, I think, this idea that it hasn't really benefited indigenous Czech films. There's been a significant emphasis on those that were co-produced with Western European films, for example, on the platforms that you looked at. But also perhaps the importance of Creative Europe in terms of funding. And I thought, these individual case studies together brought a series of questions about how do we think about scale and small nations, but also small markets? What does small mean in this context? How do we think about the size of those companies? Spotify is a huge global company as opposed to some of the local VOD providers or local subscription media streamers. How do we look at the relationship between incumbents and new entrants to markets and how they have access to those markets? How are they disruptive or not disruptive? Are there problems in terms of gatekeeping or barriers to entry? What is the importance or relevance of state subventions in these different markets, and what levels do they operate on? There's European level subventions, national level subventions in terms of tax, for example, incentives, and even local level subventions in terms of production. And then I think finally, the important questions that really guide us all around ethics and how do we conduct the ethics of working with industry partners, respecting the needs of those industry partners, but also the ethics of being able to generate data for us to study and comparative case studies to actually move the scholarship forward. So thank you.
We have about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes? 15 minutes for us for questions. Please. Oh, right, the mic.
Yes.
There it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan from Film Europe. The question to Patrick. Patrick? With all of this feeling of over-datas and the vast oceans of undefined and analytics, I mean, do you see some counter-reaction to this? Namely, the persons who are refusing to actually use the internet and Facebooks. Do you have any data on that? How many percentage of the populations are strictly, totally against it, and how old are they? Right? And the second actually remarks just to Jan. Thank you very much for taking us as an analytic case. I'm flattered. However, our income from creative media is actually 7.6% from the yearly revenue, right? Just to put it on the right, I would say, political corner. So it's I wouldn't say it's peanuts. It's very significant, but it is not a significant, in a way, business model for us. And last question I most likely forgot, which doesn't matter.
Okay, just to very briefly answer. The only empirical data point I have on this is actually my sister's husband, who is about 60, and he always asks me, you know, when do you think the internet will disappear again? So I think it's more going into the other direction. And what I wanted to bring up in this talk is the role of platforms, or more generally digital media companies, in entering our own territory as scholars. I mean, they have research divisions at Google and Facebook and Microsoft and so on. So it's a little bit like having to cope with them defining also standards for us, or maybe engaging in sort of a discussion with us about what these standards could be. And I think it's very important that this is taken seriously as an opportunity, but also as a challenge. Yeah, so just to round up the story about Spotify is that they, of course, try to shut down the project. They first issued sort of a formal complaint, which is totally okay. It's like, you know, you violated the terms of service, and then you respond politely and say, yeah, we have done so. It's a few years back, full transparency, why we did it, what we did. Please meet us, discuss the results, challenge us, bring us, you know, bring something good to this project. They never responded, but they went behind our back to the Grant Foundation and wrote a very interesting email where they asked them basically to cut off the funding, because what they stated is that we violated applicable law, ethics, and best method practice. And I think that's interesting beyond our project. And nothing ever happened, you know. Actually, it turned into a backlash for Spotify. We made everything public, but I think the idea of these companies trying to negotiate the relation between applicable law, good research ethics, and best method practices is interesting. And it has something to do with their own investment in developing these kinds of methods. So I think this is going to happen. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that exact number or percentage. I mean, yes, I'm aware that it's relatively low, this percentage. However, we get European films also distributed by Association of Czech Film Clubs and by Aero Films. So I think there is a tendency to distribute European films, or would you say that this does not play a role really when you select films? Yeah.
Our company, which is fortunately not funded by the state, yes, there are companies which are holding most like 7.6% of the market, the rest of the foundation.
Yeah.
We have to be fair in the definition.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
We have two questions. And then,
So this is a question for, I'm American, I can speak very loudly. It is a question for everyone except for Bongaro, because I know how you can answer this. So, is the problem, you just need more money? I mean, I'll just ask, like, just put it out there, like, yes. Yeah, well, this is what it comes down to, right? Is the issue with distribution and production is there just needs to be more money. And let me project into the future what I think is the next big thing. IBM just sold blockchain technology to every European bank with the idea that they are going to open up new lines of credit to all small and medium business owners. That would solve, on one hand, all of the problems that small producers and small distributors face, because it would smooth all wait time and open up what they call a host of new debt instruments to producers and distributors, and they would get to make lots more stuff. Are you excited for blockchain then? I mean, that would smooth the issue. If the problem is more money, that would be.
I'm sorry, we don't see the hidden cost. I mean, getting the amount of sustainable production, particularly financing your life, not a business. That's a fundamental problem with consumption.
Blockchain will also transform the audit culture and the provision of credits and subsidy for governments.
I have heard a lot about blockchain. I tried to get data on blockchain, and you basically have two groups. The one is seeing in blockchain, well, obviously a money printing machine, to the new copyright, or a technology that could abandon copyright because it will be all imprinted in the blockchain, etc. The others are more going into dystopia. I think neither of it is true, and I would go so far and say 10 years from now we are not talking about blockchain anymore. To your second question, if you ask if we need more money, no. In the case of Austria, that's what I tried to say is, no, not at all. That's not the problem. We need a change in the structure. If we have changed the structure after that, maybe we need more money then. But currently, it is a structural problem in the funding and in the role the state plays in the moment in financing movies. It's crowding out would be an economic expression for that.
Does anybody else want to take? Well, as a Canadian, I'm someone who says sorry even when it's not really their fault, and so I am now apologizing by saying that we'll leave the last question to Ulrika, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Patrick von der Rau. What can Spotify learn about your research? And in other words, what part of your research results is something that you really would like to communicate back to Spotify?
That's a good question, of course. Nothing, I guess. So we met them 5 years ago, before and after we got project funding, and asked them about access to the data. And what they said is, no, absolutely not. But you can write the company history. And so we did. So the book includes Spotify's company history, but it's told using a periodization going through the venture capital funding rounds. So you see how wobbly Spotify really is and how it changed its practices and so on over time. But they don't care about it. They have a very well-established working relationship with other researchers, of course. They regularly cooperate with the Royal Institute of Technology. Excellent engineers have been founding, very important for Spotify. So there's a lot of cooperation there, but humanities, I don't think really don't matter. And they have their own social science division, I think, or they try to set it up. So, alas, nothing to get there from us.
Okay, well, to make time for coffee and a stretch, I would like to please join me in thanking all of these presenters for an excellent panel this afternoon.